In the autumn of 1867, deep in a small rural town where superstition carried as much weight as science, a strange boy began to draw the attention of doctors, ministers, and curious onlookers from miles around. His name was Timothy Caldwell, a quiet child with abilities, behaviors, and unexplained phenomena surrounding him that no physician of the era could diagnose, and no scientist could understand. Witnesses told stories that seemed impossible. Medical examinations failed again and again. And soon the name Timothy Caldwell became something whispered in hallways, written in journals, and debated by scholars who had run out of logical explanations. Was he merely misunderstood? Or did Timothy represent something the scientific world simply wasn't ready to face? Before we unravel this eerie and fascinating mystery, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into history's strangest untold cases. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's step back to 1867 and uncover the extraordinary mystery of Timothy Caldwell. The boy science could not explain. In the summer of 1867, in a small village nestled between rolling hills in the English countryside, something occurred that would challenge everything the scientific community believed about the human body and the natural world. A boy, just 14 years old, began to experience phenomena so extraordinary, so utterly defiant of explanation, that doctors traveled from London to witness it themselves. They came with their instruments and their certainty, armed with the medical knowledge of the age, convinced they would find a rational answer. They left with more questions than they arrived with. This is the story of Timothy Caldwell, a teenager whose very existence became a paradox that science could not resolve, a mystery that would haunt the medical journals for decades to come, and a case that still remains unexplained to this day. What makes this story particularly remarkable is not simply that it was strange. History is filled with strange occurrences, with phenomena that eventually yield to rational investigation and explanation. No, what makes the Timothy Caldwell case genuinely extraordinary is that, despite the most rigorous examination, despite the most brilliant minds of the Victorian era putting their full attention upon him, despite technology that was considered cutting edge for its time, Timothy Caldwell defied every attempt at classification, every theory, and every explanation that could be constructed to contain what was happening to him. Between the months of June and December in that year, Timothy Caldwell demonstrated abilities and exhibited conditions that were documented by no fewer than 17 different physicians, all of whom left written records. These weren't casual observations made in passing. These were systematic, methodical records kept by men who understood the importance of accuracy, who were trained to observe, measure, and report. And yet, their records tell us as much about the limitations of human knowledge as they do about Timothy Caldwell himself. The story begins on an ordinary morning in June. Timothy was the son of a blacksmith, a sturdy boy known throughout the village for his reliability and his steady temperament. He was not prone to flights of fancy or to seeking attention. In fact, those who knew him best described him as quiet, almost reserved, the kind of boy who would be easily forgotten in a crowd. He attended the village school, helped his father in the smithy, and, by all accounts, led a completely unremarkable existence. That would all change on a single morning that would transform him from an unknown boy into a source of international scientific attention. On June 15, 1867, Timothy woke to find that his hands had begun to generate light. This was not phosphorescence or the reflection of light from an external source. This was emanation, a visible, persistent glow that emerged from his palms and extended several inches beyond his skin. His mother, discovering this in the early hours of the morning, did what any reasonable person would do. She sought medical attention. Dr. Edmund Hargrove, the village physician, was called to the Caldwell residence. He was a man of nearly 50 years, well-educated, trained in London, and respected throughout the region for his competence and his skepticism toward superstition. His first assumption, naturally, was that there must be some explanation rooted in chemistry or in the condition of the boy's skin. Perhaps Timothy had encountered a phosphorescent substance. Perhaps he had been exposed to some luminous material that had adhered to his hands. The doctor conducted an extensive examination. He washed the boy's hands thoroughly with soap and water multiple times over. The glow persisted. He examined the skin under magnification. There was no visible residue, no chemical deposit, no external substance of any kind. But here is where the case begins to take on its truly unusual character. The glow did not remain confined to Timothy's hands. By the second week, light was emerging from multiple points on his body. His forearms, his chest, the tops of his feet. The light was not constant. It would fade and intensify throughout the day, apparently responding to no external stimulus that could be identified. On some days, the glow would be so faint as to be barely visible in broad daylight. On other nights, it was bright enough to read by, casting distinct shadows in a darkened room. Dr. Hargrove began to maintain detailed notes. He recorded the times of day when the luminescence was most pronounced. He noted the color of the light, a pale bluish white with occasional hints of green at the edges. He documented the temperature of the affected areas of skin, looking for evidence of inflammation or fever. He found nothing. The skin temperature was normal. There was no inflammation, no infection, no visible pathology of any kind. Yet the light continued. Within weeks, other physicians began to arrive. Word had spread through medical circles that something extraordinary was occurring in this small village, and men of science felt compelled to investigate. Dr. William Thorpe came from Manchester. Dr. Charles Pemberton arrived from Birmingham. These were not quacks or seekers of sensation. These were trained, accomplished physicians who had built their reputations on rigorous investigation and careful diagnosis. Each arrival brought with it new theories and new examination protocols. Each departure brought with it a profound sense of bewilderment. One doctor hypothesized that the light might be produced through some as yet unknown property of phosphorus in the blood. Another theorized a relationship to the aurora borealis, suggesting that Timothy might be experiencing some kind of electromagnetic phenomenon related to atmospheric conditions. Another still proposed that this might be a manifestation of an unknown nerve condition, a disorder affecting the autonomic nervous system that caused some kind of chemical reaction in the skin cells themselves. But Timothy's condition was not static. It began to evolve in ways that seemed to follow no comprehensible pattern. By late July, witnesses, and there were many now as news had spread and people came from surrounding villages to observe the phenomenon, reported that Timothy's luminescence had begun to synchronize with his emotional state. When the boy was calm and composed, the light was subtle and gentle. When he experienced strong emotion, whether excitement or distress, the glow would intensify dramatically, sometimes flaring so brightly that witnesses would shield their eyes. This observation led to an entirely new class of theories. Perhaps this was not a physical condition at all, but rather some manifestation of nervous energy, some expression of the mind through the body that science had not yet documented. Perhaps Timothy possessed some latent psychological capacity that was expressing itself through his physiology in an unprecedented manner. The possibility opened doors to speculation that extended far beyond the purely medical, into realms that made many of the attending physicians uncomfortable. It was at this point, in early August, that the case attracted the attention of Dr. James Blackwell, perhaps the most renowned physician of his time, a man who had advised the Royal Society and whose opinion carried enormous weight in medical and scientific circles. Dr. Blackwell traveled personally to the village to examine Timothy Caldwell. He came with a retinue of assistants and with equipment that represented the very pinnacle of medical technology available in 1867. Dr. Blackwell's examination lasted 3 days. He conducted tests with meticulous precision. He measured the intensity of the light using photographic plates. He attempted to measure the heat radiation emanating from the boy's body. He took blood samples, a procedure that was considered quite advanced at the time, and examined them under the microscope looking for any cellular abnormality that might account for the phenomenon. He even went so far as to attempt to isolate and identify the specific compounds that he believed might be responsible, though his analytical capabilities were limited by the chemistry of the era. At the conclusion of his examination, Dr. Blackwell sat down to prepare his report. This report would be presented to the Royal Society, and it would be published in The Lancet and in the British Medical Journal. In it, Dr. Blackwell would state, in his measured and careful language, that he could find no natural explanation for the phenomena he had observed. He had not said that no explanation existed. He had not said that the phenomena were supernatural or impossible. He had simply stated with the full weight of his authority and his reputation that existing medical and scientific knowledge did not provide a framework for understanding what Timothy Caldwell was experiencing. This was in many ways more troubling to the scientific establishment than if Dr. Blackwell had simply declared the entire affair to be a hoax. Because by August of 1867, hoaxes were something that science knew how to handle. They could be debunked, exposed, and dismissed, but a phenomenon that defied explanation from one of the era's most respected authorities? That was something else entirely. That was an admission that there were aspects of human physiology and of the natural world that science had not yet catalogued, had not yet understood, and could not yet explain. By September of 1867, Timothy Caldwell's condition had evolved beyond the simple emission of light. New phenomena began to manifest, each one adding another layer to the deepening mystery. The first of these new developments was perhaps the most unsettling. Timothy's luminescence began to affect living organisms in his vicinity in ways that defied conventional understanding. There are documented cases of insects, flies, moths, beetles, that were exposed to Timothy's glow and subsequently exhibited behavioral changes. They would cease their normal activity and move toward the source of the light with an intensity that observers described as compulsive. Some of these insects would remain motionless for extended periods in the glow, as though in a state of profound trance. When removed from the light, they would resume normal behavior, apparently unharmed. But some did not survive. Several insects exposed to Timothy's luminescence for extended periods were found to be dead, with no apparent injury or cause of death visible upon examination. This development brought a new class of investigators into the case. Naturalists and biologists began to arrive, seeking to understand how the boy's condition might be affecting the animal kingdom. Dr. Thomas Havers, a biologist who had made his reputation studying the behavior of insects and small creatures, spent 2 weeks at the village conducting experiments. He brought various species of insects into proximity with Timothy under controlled conditions and carefully documented the results. His conclusions were cautious but significant. There appeared to be some force or influence emanating from Timothy that attracted living creatures, and that in some cases seemed to affect their viability and their normal functioning. But even as this new dimension of Timothy's condition was becoming apparent, something else was occurring that would prove even more difficult to explain. Witnesses began to report that objects in Timothy's immediate environment were being affected by his presence. These were not dramatic phenomena. They were subtle at first and easy to dismiss. Papers placed near Timothy would become unusually warm to the touch. A glass of water left on a table beside him would show signs of evaporation at a rate that seemed inconsistent with normal atmospheric conditions. Plants placed in his room would show accelerated growth, their leaves becoming more vibrant and their stems reaching upward with unusual vigor. These observations led yet another group of scientists to become involved in the investigation. Botanists, chemists, and physicists all arrived at the village, each bringing their own instruments and their own theoretical frameworks. Suddenly, the case of Timothy Caldwell had expanded from being a curiosity of medicine into something that touched upon multiple disciplines of science. It was no longer simply a question of what was happening to the boy's body. It had become a question about the nature of energy, about the interaction of living and non-living matter, and about the fundamental forces that govern the physical world. Among those who arrived during this period was Professor Heinrich Müller, a German physicist of considerable reputation who had achieved recognition for his work on electromagnetic phenomena. Professor Müller brought with him an array of instruments designed to detect and measure electromagnetic radiation, equipment that was quite sophisticated for its time, and that represented the cutting edge of physics as it existed in 1867. His arrival marked a significant shift in how the case was being investigated. The focus broadened from purely medical observation to include measurements of physical phenomena. Professor Müller's equipment detected anomalies. This was not, it should be noted, a definitive identification of what was causing them, but rather a clear indication that something unusual was occurring in the electromagnetic environment surrounding Timothy. There were fluctuations, variations in the local electromagnetic field that Professor Müller's instruments registered and that he carefully documented. These fluctuations seemed to correspond in general terms with the times when Timothy's luminescence was most intense. But the correspondence was not perfect. Sometimes the electromagnetic anomalies preceded the visible light. Sometimes they seemed to persist after the light had faded. The relationship between the electromagnetic phenomena and the visible luminescence remained unclear. During this same period, witnesses had begun to report yet another extraordinary phenomenon. There were accounts of Timothy experiencing what might be described as moments of displacement, brief intervals during which the boy seemed to be in an altered state of consciousness, and during which witnesses reported seeing what they described as images or scenes appearing in the air near him, visible only for seconds before vanishing. These accounts came from multiple independent observers, people who had no reason to coordinate their stories or to corroborate a falsehood. A shopkeeper reported seeing, for a brief moment while standing near Timothy, what appeared to be a landscape mountains and valleys, suspended in the air before him, as real and solid seeming as anything he had ever observed, and then gone. A schoolteacher described witnessing what she believed to be a figure, a person standing beside Timothy, visible for only an instant before disappearing. A farmer swore that he had seen, in the space just above Timothy's head, an image that appeared to be a pattern or symbol, geometric and elaborate, before it dissolved into nothing. These accounts were treated with great skepticism by the scientific investigators. They were the kinds of reports that seemed more aligned with hallucination or misperception than with objective phenomena. And yet, the consistency of the reports across multiple witnesses, the specificity of the descriptions, and the apparent sincerity of the observers lent them a certain credibility that could not be entirely dismissed. Some of the scientists began to wonder whether they were dealing with something that operated at the intersection of the psychological and the physical, something that might affect not only the material world but also the perceptions and cognition of those who witnessed it. By late September, a formal commission had been established to investigate the Timothy Caldwell phenomenon. This commission was composed of 12 of the most distinguished scientists and physicians in Britain. They established themselves in the village, set up a formal laboratory space, and began a systematic investigation that would continue for the remainder of the year. The commission's protocols were rigorous. Every observation was recorded. Every experiment was repeated multiple times to ensure reproducibility. Every precaution was taken to eliminate the possibility of fraud or misunderstanding. And yet, despite all of this rigor, despite all of this careful methodology, the commission found itself no closer to an explanation. Instead, with each week of investigation, the mystery seemed to deepen. New phenomena were observed. Existing phenomena took on new characteristics. Theories were constructed and then abandoned when new data did not fit the model. It was a process of continuous reassessment and continuous bewilderment. As October arrived and the investigation moved into what would be its most intense period, the medical aspects of Timothy's condition began to reveal themselves in ways that seemed to contradict everything that physicians understood about human physiology. The boy should have been dying. By any rational assessment of his physical condition, Timothy Caldwell should have been experiencing severe medical distress, possibly fatal in its consequences. The luminescence that had been his primary symptom was accompanied by what the attending physicians identified as extraordinary metabolic activity. Measurements of Timothy's pulse revealed rates that would normally be considered wildly abnormal, sometimes exceeding 120 beats per minute when the boy was at rest. His respiration rate was similarly elevated. His body temperature fluctuated within a range that would typically indicate severe fever or systemic infection, yet Timothy showed no signs of fever. He was not delirious. He was not weak or incapacitated. He moved about with normal strength and coordination. He ate normally and digested his food without apparent difficulty. Most perplexing of all was that Timothy did not seem to be suffering from the consequences of what should have been an exhausting and debilitating condition. A human being maintaining such elevated metabolic rates for an extended period would, in the normal course of events, suffer from severe weight loss, from malnutrition, from progressive weakening of the body's systems. Yet Timothy maintained his weight. He showed no signs of muscle wasting. When his strength was tested by the examining physicians, he proved to be as strong as any healthy 14-year-old boy of his size and build. Dr. Blackwell, in his preliminary report to the commission, expressed profound bewilderment at the contradiction. He wrote, "The boy presents a condition that appears to be untenable from a physiological standpoint. The energy expenditure indicated by his elevated pulse and respiration should result in catastrophic weight loss and systemic degradation. Yet no such degradation is observed. Either our understanding of metabolic function is fundamentally incomplete, or there is some mechanism by which Timothy is generating or absorbing energy from an external source in a manner that contradicts established principles of thermodynamics." This last sentence proved to be particularly provocative. The suggestion that Timothy might be drawing energy from an external source opened up entirely new avenues of speculation and investigation. What could this external source be? How could a human body interface with such a source? What would be the mechanism by which energy could be transferred from this hypothetical external source into Timothy's physiology? The commission decided to conduct a series of experiments designed to test the hypothesis that Timothy was somehow interacting with an unknown form of environmental energy. They constructed a chamber, a room constructed entirely of copper and lead, materials that were believed to have properties that might shield against unknown forms of radiation or energy transmission. They placed Timothy in this chamber for extended periods and monitored his condition. If Timothy was drawing energy from an external source, the theory went, isolation from that source should result in a change in his condition. But the shielded chamber produced no observable change in Timothy's luminescence, his metabolic activity, or his physical condition. The boy seemed to be just as luminescent, just as energized, just as physically robust in the shielded chamber as he was outside of it. This finding seemed to contradict the hypothesis that an external energy source was responsible for his condition. And yet, it also seemed to rule out a purely internal physiological mechanism, because no known internal mechanism could account for the sustained elevation in metabolic activity. The commission was, in essence, facing a paradox. The data seemed to require that Timothy was not drawing energy from an external source, and yet it also seemed to require that he was. The conventional either-or of scientific thinking did not seem to apply. There appeared to be a contradiction so fundamental that it suggested the possibility that the very framework through which the scientists were attempting to understand the phenomenon was inadequate. It was during this period that one of the commission members, Dr. Robert Ashford, a physicist with interests in theoretical matters, proposed a hypothesis that would have been considered highly speculative and even somewhat fantastical by the standards of the time. Dr. Ashford suggested that Timothy might be operating under a different set of physical laws than those that governed ordinary matter and ordinary human physiology. He proposed tentatively and with considerable hedging language that there might be aspects of reality, aspects of natural law, that had not yet been codified or understood by contemporary science, and that Timothy might be somehow expressing or manifesting these unknown aspects of natural law. This proposal was met with considerable skepticism and even with some ridicule from some quarters. The idea that there could be aspects of nature that operated according to principles fundamentally different from those that science had already established seemed to many to be an abandonment of scientific rigor and a descent into speculation and superstition. And yet, Dr. Ashford's hypothesis had a certain logic to it that could not be entirely dismissed. The evidence did seem to suggest that Something was happening that could not be explained within the existing framework of scientific understanding. It was at this point that the investigation began to take on a different character. Rather than approaching Timothy with the assumption that there must be a conventional explanation that simply had not yet been discovered, some of the investigators began to approach the case with what might be described as epistemic humility. They began to consider the possibility that they were not simply looking for a missing piece of a puzzle that was otherwise complete. They were beginning to contemplate the possibility that the puzzle itself might be incomplete, that there were in fact gaps in human understanding of the natural world, gaps that the case of Timothy Caldwell was revealing. Among the physicians on the commission, however, there remained considerable resistance to this line of thinking. These were men whose entire professional identities were based on the application of known scientific principles to medical problems. The suggestion that there might be phenomena that fell outside the scope of known science was, for many of them, deeply unsettling. It threatened the fundamental assumptions upon which their careers and their authority were based. Yet the evidence continued to accumulate, continued to press against the boundaries of conventional explanation. And Timothy Caldwell, the source of all this ferment, remained largely passive throughout the process. The boy submitted to the examinations, answered the questions, and allowed himself to be measured and tested, all with what observers described as remarkable equanimity and patience. He did not claim to understand his own condition. He did not present himself as possessing special knowledge or unusual abilities. He was, by all accounts, simply a boy who was experiencing something extraordinary, something that was as mysterious to him as it was to the scientists who were attempting to understand it. As November arrived, the investigation took an unexpected turn. Several members of the commission began to notice psychological changes occurring in those who were in close and frequent contact with Timothy Caldwell. These changes were subtle at first, barely noticeable, but they became progressively more pronounced as the month advanced. The most consistent change observed was an alteration in the cognitive and perceptual abilities of individuals who spent significant time in Timothy's presence. Witnesses and investigators reported enhanced clarity of thought, sharper memory, and what some described as heightened intuitive understanding. A physician who had been working with Timothy for several weeks reported that he seemed to be thinking with unusual clarity, that problems that had seemed insurmountable suddenly appeared to have obvious solutions, and that he was experiencing a kind of mental acuity that he had not felt since his youth. But alongside these positive cognitive changes, there were also reports of disturbances. Some individuals experienced vivid and unusual dreams on nights when they had spent significant time with Timothy. These were not nightmares, they were not characterized by fear or distress, but they were remarkable for their vividness and their apparent coherence. They seemed to operate according to their own consistent logic and grammar, and those who experienced them often reported emerging from sleep with a sense that they had been receiving information or communication, though the content of that information was difficult to articulate or hold in consciousness after waking. A few individuals reported what might be described as moments of apparent perception beyond their normal sensory capacities. One scientist claimed that while in Timothy's presence, he had somehow become aware of a conversation occurring in another room of the house, not through hearing it directly, but through some other mode of perception, as though he had simply known what was being discussed without having heard the words. Another researcher reported that she had become aware of a person approaching from down the corridor several seconds before she could have heard the sound of their footsteps, as though she had somehow perceived their approach in advance. These reports began to accumulate, and they attracted the attention of a new group of investigators. Psychologists and those interested in the emerging field of what might be called experimental psychology began to arrive at the village. They wanted to conduct formal tests of the cognitive and perceptual changes that had been reported. They wanted to see whether Timothy's presence was genuinely affecting the mental capacities of those around him, or whether this was simply a case of suggestibility and expectancy effects. Whether, in other words, people were simply believing they were experiencing enhanced mental abilities because they expected to experience them. The tests that were constructed were sophisticated for the time. Researchers would have subjects perform cognitive tasks, mathematical problems, memory exercises, pattern recognition tasks, while in Timothy's presence and again at a distance from him, without Timothy's knowledge of when the tests were being conducted. The results were striking. The data appeared to show that cognitive performance was significantly enhanced when subjects were in close proximity to Timothy. The difference was not enormous, but it was consistent and it was measurable. Subjects performed better on cognitive tasks when they were near Timothy than they did when they were distant from him. But here again, there was a complication. The effect did not appear to be consistent or uniform across all subjects. Some individuals showed dramatic improvement in cognitive performance when near Timothy. Others showed little to no change. Some actually showed a slight decrease in performance. And the factors that seemed to determine whether an individual would experience enhancement or decline appeared to have no obvious relationship to any measurable variable. It was not a matter of age or education or prior cognitive ability. It seemed almost random, or if it followed some pattern, that pattern was not immediately apparent to the investigators. One psychologist proposed that the effect might be related to the psychological state or emotional condition of the individual subjects. Perhaps individuals who were in a receptive state, individuals who were open to new experiences and who were not resistant to the idea that something unusual might occur, were more likely to experience the enhancement effect. Individuals who approach the tests with skepticism and resistance might be less likely to experience the effect. This hypothesis could not be definitively tested because measuring the inner psychological state of a person was not something that could be done with any precision during this era. What was emerging from these investigations was a picture of Timothy Caldwell that was increasingly complex and increasingly difficult to characterize in terms of conventional categories. He was not simply a boy with a medical condition. He was not simply an example of some previously unknown disease or pathological state. He appeared to be something more complicated, an individual who was interacting with those around him in ways that affected not only their perceptions, but their actual cognitive functioning, and perhaps even their psychological states. This realization began to trouble some of the investigators. It raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of the investigation itself. Was it possible that by studying Timothy, they were changing themselves? Was it possible that the accumulated contact with Timothy over weeks and months was affecting the investigators' own cognitive processes, their ability to think clearly about the case, their capacity to maintain scientific objectivity? Could it be that the very act of investigation was compromising the investigators' ability to be investigated objectively? Several members of the commission proposed that new investigators, individuals who had not previously been exposed to Timothy Caldwell, should be brought in to conduct fresh observations and assessments. This fresh perspective, it was hoped, would provide a check against the possibility that the original investigators had, through prolonged exposure to Timothy, become somehow compromised in their thinking or perception. The commission agreed to this proposal, and new physicians and scientists were brought to the village in November. These individuals conducted their own examinations and tests, and what they found was, in many respects, confirmation of what had already been documented. But their reports also contained a new element, a note of almost bewilderment at the difficulty they had in maintaining intellectual distance from the phenomena they were observing. Multiple investigators reported that they found themselves, despite their commitment to scientific objectivity, becoming emotionally invested in understanding Timothy's case, feeling a kind of pull toward attempting to solve the mystery, as though the very presence of the unsolved mystery was activating some drive or compulsion in their minds. One investigator wrote in his report, "I find myself unable to disengage from this case even when I am away from the village, even when engaged in entirely different activities. My thoughts return to Timothy Caldwell and to the phenomena surrounding him. It is as though the puzzle he presents has lodged itself in my consciousness and is exerting a constant pressure toward resolution. I am uncertain whether this is merely the normal psychological response of a scientist to an interesting problem, or whether it represents something more unusual, perhaps a genuine effect of proximity to Timothy that has persisted, even after physical distance has been established." By early December 1867, a phenomenon that had been present throughout the investigation, but had not been systematically studied, began to receive focused attention. Observers and investigators had noticed, with increasing frequency, that their subjective sense of the passage of time seemed to be altered when they were in Timothy's presence. More remarkably, there were indications that this alteration was not merely subjective, but that something was genuinely occurring in relation to the measurement of time itself. The first clear indication of this came from a clock. The commission had, as part of their experimental setup, installed an expensive and highly accurate clock in the room where Timothy spent most of his time. This clock was a precision instrument, one of the finest available at the time, and it was regularly checked against other timepieces and against astronomical observations to ensure its accuracy. Yet investigators began to notice discrepancies between the time shown on this particular clock and the time shown on other clocks in the house. At first, these discrepancies were small, a few seconds here, a few seconds there. But as December progressed, the discrepancies became more pronounced. The clock in Timothy's room would sometimes run fast, sometimes slow, and sometimes it would seem to skip periods entirely. Individuals would look at the clock, note the time, and then moments later discover that far more time had passed than they would have expected, even accounting for the possibility of distraction or inattention. This phenomenon was disturbing enough that it prompted the commission to conduct controlled experiments. They brought in multiple precise timepieces and had them all running simultaneously in Timothy's room. What they observed was startling. The clocks did not all run at the same rate. Some ran fast, some ran slow, and some appeared to be affected in ways that defied simple description. One clock seemed to oscillate, running fast and then slow and then fast again in a cyclical pattern. Another clock, which had been running perfectly accurately for months, simply stopped one afternoon and could not be restarted. When it was disassembled for examination, no mechanical defect could be found. The commission brought in a specialist in precision instruments, a craftsman who had built some of the finest clocks in England. This specialist examined the clocks in the room and could offer no explanation for why they should be behaving in this manner. The room itself showed no physical anomalies. There was no temperature variation that might affect the mechanical function of the clocks. There was no vibration or disturbance. Yet the clocks persisted in behaving in ways that seemed to violate their normal functioning principles. This discovery opened up a new avenue of investigation, one that touched upon physics and upon what might be described as the fundamental nature of time itself. How could time be running at different rates in different locations, separated only by small distances within a single room? What would cause such a phenomenon? What does it mean for time to have different rates of passage in different places? These were questions that touched upon aspects of physics that were still being developed and refined during this period. The nature of time and the question of whether time was absolute or relative were matters of philosophical and scientific debate. The case of Timothy Caldwell seemed to be providing what might be described as empirical evidence that time, at least under certain conditions, was not absolute, that it could vary, that its rate of passage could be affected by something, some force or influence that was not yet understood or characterized. A physicist brought in specifically to investigate these temporal anomalies proposed that whatever phenomenon was being expressed through Timothy's luminescence and through the other effects that had been observed might have a relationship to the underlying temporal structure of reality. He suggested that time, rather than being a simple linear progression from past through present to future, might have properties and dimensions that science had not yet explored. He proposed that Timothy might be, in some way, interacting with these deeper temporal dimensions, and that this interaction was manifesting in the observed clock anomalies and in the subjective experience of altered time passage reported by many observers. Most of the commission was skeptical of this hypothesis. It seemed too speculative, too removed from observable fact. And yet, the temporal anomalies were undeniable. They could be measured. Multiple observers had witnessed them. They could not be dismissed as hallucination or misperception. The response of the commission was to attempt to conduct more rigorous measurements. They brought in astronomical instruments and attempted to correlate the observed clock anomalies with external temporal references, with the positions of stars, with astronomical events, with other measures of time that were independent of mechanical instruments. What they found was that the mechanical clock seemed to be deviating from these external temporal references, suggesting that the anomalies in the clocks might be indicating something genuine about the local temporal environment in the vicinity of Timothy Caldwell, rather than being simply mechanical failures or peculiarities of the instruments. Yet even as this evidence accumulated, there remained a profound difficulty in characterizing what was occurring. The temporal anomalies seemed to be real. They seemed to be indicating something about the nature of time and its behavior in Timothy's vicinity. But there was no framework within contemporary physics that could adequately explain what was occurring. The nature of time was still being worked out. Einstein's theory of relativity, which would eventually provide a framework for understanding variable rates of time passage in different gravitational fields and under conditions of relative motion, would not be published until 1905, nearly 40 years after Timothy Caldwell's case. The commission was forced to operate without an adequate theoretical framework. They had observations and measurements, but they had no model that could integrate these observations into a coherent understanding. It was, in many respects, a return to the fundamental problem that had characterized the entire investigation from the beginning. They were in the position of having data that was meaningful and real, but for which existing science had no adequate explanation. In the latter weeks of December, as the investigation moved toward its conclusion, the Commission had announced that they would be terminating their formal study of Timothy Caldwell at the end of the year. A convergence occurred. All of the various phenomena that had been observed separately throughout the investigation seemed to intensify and to manifest in interconnected ways. The luminescence that had characterized Timothy's condition from the beginning became more intense and more variable. But now the pattern of the luminescence seemed to correlate with the cognitive changes in nearby observers. When Timothy's light intensified, observers reported enhanced mental clarity. When the light diminished, the cognitive effects diminished as well. Similarly, the temporal anomalies in the clocks seemed to follow the same pattern of intensification and diminution. It was as though all of the various manifestations of Timothy's condition, the light, the effects on cognition, the temporal anomalies, the attraction of living creatures, the acceleration of plant growth, all of these were expressions of a single underlying phenomenon, a unified manifestation of something that had multiple apparent aspects depending on what one was measuring or observing. A chemist on the Commission proposed that all of these phenomena might be different expressions of a single form of energy that was being generated by or flowing through Timothy's body. The luminescence would be the visible manifestation of this energy. The cognitive effects would be the result of this energy interacting with the neural tissue of observers. The temporal anomalies would be the result of this energy affecting the mechanical function of instruments. The biological effects would be the result of this energy affecting living organisms. It was an appealing hypothesis because it provided a unified framework for understanding all of the disparate phenomena. But the hypothesis faced a significant problem. What would this energy be? Existing categories of energy, heat, light, electromagnetic radiation, mechanical energy, did not seem adequate.